Barron Trump destroys TV host in live debate. His response leaves America in shock. The world was watching. Millions of eyes glued to their screens, waiting to witness what could be one of the most talked about interviews in modern political history. Inside the colossal conference hall, the air was thick with anticipation. The towering glass walls reflected the bright stage lights, creating an almost surreal glow over the packed audience. Journalists, analysts, and political commentators whispered among themselves, their hushed voices blending with the occasional sound of cameras clicking. The tension was undeniable. Everyone knew this wasn't just another debate. This was a defining moment. At the center of it all sat Eleanor Chase, the seasoned TV host known for her razor-sharp questioning and unshakable demeanor. Over the years, she had dismantled some of the most powerful figures in politics, exposing flaws, contradictions, and weaknesses with ease. She was relentless, calculated, and above all, determined to get the truth. Tonight, however, her challenge was unlike any before. Seated across from her, composed and unreadable, was Barron Trump. He was no longer just a name people whispered about. He was here, live, under the spotlight, ready to face the questions that had been building for years. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, he sat with an air of quiet confidence. There was no sign of nerves, no restless movement, only an unshaken presence that filled the space around him. His expression remained calm, his gaze unwavering. For someone who had largely stayed out of public debates, he appeared remarkably prepared. The camera zoomed in, capturing every detail. The way Barron sat, the way Eleanor adjusted her microphone, the subtle flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She had studied him for years, waiting for the moment he would step forward and speak. And now, here he was, positioned across from her, ready to respond to whatever she threw his way. The room fell into silence. Even the quiet hum of whispers faded as Eleanor finally leaned forward. There was a flicker of a smile on her face, a sign that she knew exactly what she was about to do. Test the young man before her, push him, challenge him, and see if he would stumble under pressure. But as Barron met her gaze, completely unfazed, it became clear to everyone in that room. This wasn't going to be an easy interview. Eleanor let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then, with a controlled but piercing tone, she spoke. "Mr. Trump, for years, you've remained silent, staying away from public debates, never stepping into the political spotlight. People have speculated, questioned, even doubted. But now, here you are. Why now? Why speak up at this moment?" The question hung in the air, charged with expectation. The audience, seated in rows of anticipation, leaned in just a little closer. Barron, however, remained composed. He didn't rush to answer. He didn't fidget or look away. Instead, he met Eleanor's gaze with an unreadable expression, as if he had already anticipated the question and had all the time in the world to respond. The pause was deliberate, making everyone in the room focus on him, waiting. Then, in a calm yet firm voice, he spoke. "Everything has its time, Eleanor," he said smoothly. "And this is the time." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made the audience shift in their seats. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't hesitation. It was a statement, clear and deliberate. The room seemed to tighten around those few words, and for a brief second, even Eleanor hesitated, caught off guard by the sheer confidence in his tone. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in understanding, while others exchanged knowing glances, trying to read between the lines. Eleanor, ever the professional, recovered quickly. She wasn't here to let him dictate the pace of this conversation. If he thought he could get away with short, calculated responses, she was ready to push harder. "You say this is the time," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "But that doesn't quite answer the question, does it? What changed? What made you decide that now, after years of staying in the shadows, was the right moment to step forward?" The challenge in her voice was clear. She was pressing him, waiting for him to stumble, to reveal hesitation, to give her something she could dig into. But Barron didn't flinch. His posture remained as steady as ever, his expression unbothered. "It's not about what changed," he replied, his voice just as even as before. "It's about recognizing when a moment demands action. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the right time, waiting for permission. I don't believe in that. When the moment comes, you take it. Another wave of murmurs spread across the audience. There was something undeniably compelling about the way he spoke. Not defensive, not rehearsed, but controlled. He wasn't just answering questions. He was shaping the narrative, turning the conversation in his favor. Eleanor, sharp as ever, recognized it instantly. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. This wasn't a young man grasping for words, struggling under the weight of expectation. No, this was someone who had thought this through. Someone who had walked into this room knowing exactly what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. And for the first time that night, Eleanor realized this was going to be a far more interesting debate than she had expected. Eleanor didn't let up. She had seen too many political figures dance around questions, and she wasn't about to let Barron Trump slip through so easily. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "It's interesting," she began, choosing her words carefully, "that you talk about taking action when, let's be honest, the path laid before you wasn't exactly filled with obstacles. You come from power, influence, and wealth. You didn't have to struggle to be heard. Your name alone commands attention. So I ask you, can you truly say you've earned this moment? Or are you simply walking through doors that were already open for you?" A hush fell over the audience. It was a direct challenge, one designed to put him on the defensive, to force him into a corner where he would have to acknowledge the privileges that came with his last name. For many, this would be the moment where cracks would start to show, where uncertainty or defensiveness would slip in. But Barron didn't even blink. Instead, he let a small, almost knowing smile cross his face, as if he had been expecting this very question. His voice remained as steady as ever when he replied, "A name can open doors, Eleanor, but it's up to the person to walk through them." There was a beat of silence. The response was simple, yet powerful. He wasn't denying his privilege, nor was he trying to downplay it. He was shifting the focus entirely. The audience, clearly intrigued, murmured in reaction. Even Eleanor hesitated for half a second, as if processing how smoothly he had sidestepped the trap she had laid. But the doors were still open, she pushed, determined to regain control. Most people don't get those opportunities handed to them. You didn't have to fight for a platform. It was given to you. Barron nodded slightly, acknowledging the point, but he still wasn't rattled. "An opportunity given means nothing if you don't use it well," he said. "Plenty of people come from privilege, and yet not all of them make an impact. Legacy might introduce you to the world, but it doesn't define who you become. That part is up to you." The tension in the room shifted. Eleanor knew she had to tread carefully now. She had walked into this debate expecting to take control, to guide the conversation as she always did. But with every question she asked, Barron wasn't just answering. He was redirecting. He wasn't playing defense. He was playing offense in the most subtle yet effective way. She adjusted her posture, her sharp eyes studying him. "So you're saying that despite your last name, despite the wealth and power behind you, you believe you would be in this exact same position if you weren't a Trump?" Barron exhaled slowly, his expression thoughtful. "No one exists in a vacuum, Eleanor. We're all shaped by where we come from. But the real question isn't whether I would be here. It's what I choose to do now that I am." Another murmur spread across the room. It wasn't a deflection. It wasn't an excuse. It was a statement that forced everyone to rethink the premise of the argument itself. Eleanor had intended to pin him down with his own privilege, but instead, he had turned it into a discussion about personal responsibility. For the first time that evening, she felt the dynamic shift. She wasn't just questioning Barron Trump anymore. She was facing someone who knew exactly how to navigate this conversation. Someone who, despite his young age, understood how to control a narrative. This wasn't going to be a simple interview. This was a battle of intellect, and Barron wasn't just holding his ground. He was taking it. Eleanor could feel the energy in the room shifting. Barron wasn't just answering her questions. He was commanding the conversation. Every response was calculated, every statement precise. He wasn't stumbling, wasn't hesitating, and that, more than anything, made him unpredictable. She needed to push him harder. She adjusted slightly in her chair, her tone measured but pressing. "Let's address the question everyone has been asking," she said. "Your father's legacy is undeniable. His influence, His impact, it shaped the political landscape for years. Whether people support him or not, one thing is clear. His presence in politics is impossible to ignore. Given that, the world expects you to follow in his footsteps. So, let's be direct, will you? The moment the question left her lips, the room seemed to tighten. The audience, already captivated, now held their breath. This was it, the question that had been looming over the entire debate. Political analysts had speculated about it for years. Commentators had dissected every move Barron had made, trying to predict whether he would carry his father's torch. Now, with the world watching, he had to answer. For the first time that evening, Barron shifted in his seat. Not out of discomfort, but with quiet intention. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table between them, his gaze locked onto Eleanor's. There was no flicker of doubt, no trace of hesitation. His voice was steady, unwavering. Leadership isn't about following footsteps, he said. It's about creating your own path. A ripple of reaction spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged quick glances, murmuring among themselves. But the applause, subtle at first, grew louder, spreading across the room like a slow-building wave. It wasn't just the words that struck a chord. It was the way he said them. Barron wasn't distancing himself from his father, nor was he embracing the expectation that he would follow the same road. He was defining himself on his own terms. Eleanor let the applause settle before responding. She had expected him to be careful with his answer, to either confirm or deny the speculation outright. But instead, he had done something far more powerful. He had reframed the question entirely. "You say that," she challenged, "but your name alone carries expectations. Whether you like it or not, people will always compare you to your father. No matter what path you take, that shadow will follow. How do you escape it?" Barron tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. But when he spoke, there was no uncertainty in his voice. "I don't need to escape anything," he said simply. "It's not about running from a name. It's about standing in the light you create for yourself." This time, the reaction was immediate. The audience responded with another round of applause, louder than before. Eleanor, ever the professional, maintained her composure, but she knew what had just happened. Barron had taken control of the conversation in a way few could. He wasn't just answering her questions, he was setting the tone, shaping the narrative, defining himself before anyone else could. She studied him carefully, realizing something important. He wasn't just prepared for this debate. He had been waiting for it. Every word, every pause, every calculated response was part of something bigger. He wasn't just reacting. He was leading, and in that moment, she understood Barron Trump wasn't here to play defense. He was here to make a statement. Eleanor could feel the weight of the moment settling over the room. Every exchange, every carefully measured answer had led to this. Barron had proven to be more than just a name, more than just the son of a powerful man. He had held his ground, maneuvered through her toughest questions with ease, and even turned the narrative in his favor. But there was still one final move left to make, one last question that could define everything. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to draw the audience in closer. "You've spoken about leadership, about forging your own path," she said. "But let's get to the question everyone is really asking. If America calls on you to lead, will you say yes?" The room froze. It was the question that had been hanging in the air from the moment the interview started. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a moment of decision. If he said yes, he would be confirming every speculation, stepping fully into the political world he had managed to keep at a distance for so long. If he said no, he risked looking like someone who only wanted the attention without the responsibility. There was no easy way out. But Barron didn't rush to answer. He didn't let the weight of the question force him into a quick response. Instead, he let the silence linger, stretching just long enough for the tension to thicken. Then, with complete composure, he leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and yet it carried a quiet power that filled the entire room. "The real question," he said smoothly, "isn't whether I would say yes. It's whether America is ready for a leader who thinks differently." For a second, there was nothing, just stunned silence. Then, like a wave crashing over the room, the reaction came. Gasps, murmurs, applause. The shift in energy was almost tangible. Barron hadn't just answered the question, he had flipped it entirely. He hadn't allowed himself to be trapped by a simple yes or no. Instead, he had thrown the challenge back, making everyone in the audience rethink their own expectations. Eleanor blinked, the flicker of surprise in her eyes barely noticeable but present. She had expected confidence, had expected a strategic response. But this was something else. He wasn't playing defense, wasn't dodging. He had just turned the entire conversation on its head. "You didn't answer the question," she said after a moment, attempting to regain control. "Would you or wouldn't you?" Barron's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Leadership isn't about seeking power," he said. "It's about responsibility. If the time comes, if it's necessary, then decisions will be made. But what matters isn't whether I want the role. It's whether the country is ready for real change." The applause grew louder. This wasn't just an answer. It was a statement, one that left room for interpretation, one that refused to be boxed in. Eleanor knew this kind of response well. It wasn't a commitment, but it wasn't a denial either. It was a move made by someone who understood the game, someone who knew how to stay in control of the narrative without giving too much away. She took a slow breath, measuring him once more. "So you're considering it," she said, her voice careful. Barron met her gaze, unshaken. "I consider a lot of things," he said simply, "but leadership isn't about ambition. It's about purpose." The room erupted again, the energy shifting completely in his favor. Eleanor could see it. He wasn't just answering her questions anymore. He was shaping the entire discussion. He had taken control in a way that few ever could. And as the applause echoed through the grand hall, it became clear to everyone watching. Whether he had planned it or not, Barron Trump had just changed the conversation forever. The debate was over, but the impact was just beginning. As the cameras powered down and the murmurs of the audience turned into a rising chatter, it became clear that something significant had just taken place. Within minutes, social media was flooded with reactions. News outlets scrambled to release their first reports, each one dissecting every word, every pause, every shift in Barron's tone. Some called it a defining moment, proof that he was more than just a name. Others accused him of being too calculated, too polished, suggesting that his answers were carefully crafted to leave just enough mystery without making any real commitments. But one thing was certain: nobody could ignore what had just happened. Political analysts debated endlessly. Some praised his composure, calling him a visionary who had just redefined political discourse in a single night. Others saw him as a strategist, someone who had studied the game long before stepping onto the stage. Supporters hailed his responses as a breath of fresh air, while critics claimed he had masterfully avoided giving direct answers. The divide was sharp, but the fact remained: Barron Trump had dominated the conversation, and the world was now paying attention. Backstage, away from the flashing lights and the swirling chaos of reporters, Barron sat alone in a quiet room. His face remained unreadable as he watched the news unfold on a screen in front of him. Clips of the debate were already playing, headlines flashing bold statements. "Barron Trump shocks America. A new political force? Masterful or just well-coached?" The discussion was no longer about whether he had the ability to hold his own in an interview. It was about what came next. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced down and saw a message from his father. "You did well today. Stay focused. The world is watching." Barron exhaled slowly, tapping the screen before setting the phone back down. The words were brief, but he understood their weight. This was no longer just speculation, no longer just whispers of what he might become. Tonight had changed something. He had stepped into the arena, not just as the son of a former president, but as a voice of his own. And whether the world was ready for it or not, this was only the beginning.